Okay, great, thanks. I'd like to introduce our next presenter. So for our last sessions, we have Peta Hopkins from Bond University and Cathy Slaven from Queensland University of Technology, who will be talking about two peas in a pod. So I'm handing it over to our presenters.
Okay, can you see my screen? Okay, welcome everyone to this last session of the conference. We are indeed talking about two peas in a pod, making physical resource sharing snappy with a regional hybrid pod. Contrary to the program which advertised, Narelle would also be speaking with us today. It will just be Cathy and me, but we do acknowledge the effort that Narelle and Jessie Donaghy put into helping us prepare for this presentation. Whoops. Too far. Let's go back. Where are the slide controls? Wow. Okay, before we dig into some details and acknowledgement of country, the Jingari from the Gold Coast, that's the greeting from the Yugambeh language group, where Bond University is located. We acknowledge the Kombumerri people, the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which the university now stands. We pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging.
And I would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara as the First Nations owners of the lands from where I'm speaking today. I pay respects to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits and recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. And I also acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community.
Some background for you and a little comparison. I know we called this two peas in a pod, and I think after this slide you might see that we're not exactly twins, but we couldn't resist the pun, so bear with us. So Bond University and QUT are located within about 100 kilometres of each other. Bond is on the Gold Coast. We have a student population of around about 4,500 and a staff population of about 1,400. We have one Alma resource sharing library, which operates across a main library, a law library and a storage library. All of those facilities are physically within 50 metres of each other. In terms of our physical resource sharing requests over the past year, we have had 676 physical items sent to us from other libraries, and we've shipped 461 out to other institutions. Resource sharing is undertaken by our customer services team, and this team has some other roles as well. So they do digitisations for course reserves, physical reserve collection, service desk, basic inquiries, and trialling online chat inquiries as well. We have Rapido, which includes Rapid ILL, and we have implemented that in July 2021. We went live with it then. All of our students and staff can request resource sharing. We do not pass charges on to them, and there's no request limit. And the other thing to remember is that with our Primo, we have the default search set to expanded for easy requesting. So all of the global title index records from other libraries' holdings are visible to our staff and students as soon as they search.
QUT, so we're located in Brisbane. We have about 50,000 students and about 5,000 staff. We have one Alma resource sharing library, and we use that for 3 of our libraries across 2 campuses that are only a couple of kilometres apart. Our physical requests over the past 12 months, we have, for borrowing, we've had 744 physical loans filled, and we have shipped out 937. So as you can see now, we're currently a net lender as far as physical requests is concerned, which is a bit of a change for us. We're usually on it, previously had been kind of level. We have a standalone resource sharing team, and so their work is dedicated on just sort of the resource sharing side of things. We also have Rapido, which includes Rapid ILL, and we implemented that in July 2022, so we're about 12 months behind Bond. Also, like Bond, all of our students and staff can place requests. It's a free service. We have no limits. But unlike Bond, we do not have our default search expanded. We still make students click that extra link to search beyond our collection.
Notes up. Okay, so this is what we're going to cover off today, a bit of background or the drivers for establishing a South East Queensland Rapido pod. We'll look at how we did it, cover off some facts and figures on how it's working out for us. We will then talk a little bit about hybrid pods and how we're thinking about moving forward with getting Alma Library into the pod. And then bearing all that in mind, what opportunities does this open for us as a wider community in the future? Okay, so in January of 2022, QLOC, the Queensland University Libraries Office of Cooperation, established a resource sharing initiative. And this is a strategic group, not one of the communities of practice. So it was established initially for 12 months and with quite specific goals that we wanted to achieve. We had members from across all of QLOC, so not just those in South East Queensland. We had members not just using Alma resource sharing and Rapido resource sharing, so it was a wider group than that. And our goals were to explore reciprocal arrangements and to look at maximising our system's capabilities, especially bearing in mind that many of us do share similar products from Ex Libris, but not exclusively just looking at those. Sorry, Cathy.
No, you go.
Okay. So the group agreed on terms and then we looked at implementing them as best as we could across the different systems that we had in place. Over to you.
Okay. So as you can see, whilst Bond and QUT are both part of the Australia Rapido pod, which, we love using, but there does come with challenges, particularly delivery times, given the large geographical location of the Australia pod. So it could be a bit unpredictable as to, how long something could take to deliver. And another concern we had was that our requesters as students would lose interest by the time they'd placed a request and it would take so long for it to turn up. And so that's why we were sort of looking at ways to explore something more regional where we could get stuff to our users quicker.
Okay, for some geographic context then, looking at the map, we're really looking at a regional pod that's based around Brisbane, Gold Coast, Northern New South Wales region. And for this specific hybrid pod, we identified that there are at least 4 institutions that potentially could join the pod. So Bond and QUT, both using Rapido, University of the Sunshine Coast and Southern Cross University are using Alma resource sharing. They're not in the pod at the moment. We'll talk about that a bit later on, but you get the idea. That's the area that we're focusing on for this pod.
And so some of the goals for a local South East Queensland pod, as I mentioned before, it's the quicker delivery times that was probably one of the main drivers. Getting stuff turned around quickly, helping students get the material they need, not having us request books that then sit on the shelf that we have to return, a week or 2 down the track because they've never been collected. The other perspective that we also thought was very important is the sustainability perspective, as in shorter freight distances if we're just moving stuff around our region. So it's preferable for us to be able to locate and obtain a copy of a physical item that's just nearby and not having to ship it across the country where possible. And we also wanted to increase transaction-free sharing with our Alma resource sharing partners in the region. So I'm going to go through now what we did to set up or grow our local South East Queensland pod. So we had a couple of steps. The first one was we had to agree on terms. And now a lot of this came out of the discussions with our QLOC resource sharing initiative, where we were talking with institutions that were part of that. So it's not just South East Queensland, but broader as well. So based on some of the discussions there, we agreed on some new some new terms, and primarily it's a 5-day delivery and 112-day loan with no renewals and a 3-day expiry. But what's different to the Australia pod, which is 7-day delivery, this is a 5-day. So we just wanted to try and shorten that. So amongst ourselves, particularly because it's only a Rapido, we only implemented it as a Rapido pod to start with, which is between QT and Bond. That was relatively easy for us to agree between the two of us. We then contacted Ex Libris and said we wanted a pod created. So we just had to supply the terms that we'd agreed on. And within a week, they had set it up. It was very quick. And what we had to do then was define our participating items if we wanted it to be different to what we're using in the Australia pod. We select South East Queensland pod as our priority pod, with the Australia pod second, and then requests as they come in, they will, if they can be filled by the South East Queensland pod, that's where they will go. So we're up to that point at the moment. So as our presentation is called, there's only 2 Ps in our pod at the moment, us and QUT, and we're now looking to see if we can graft some Alma resource sharing sites on to our Rapido pod, just to grow it. And so to talk about how this is working out for us, so this is from the perspective of Bond and QUT. Here are some facts and figures. So as you can see, this is data from this year, beginning of this year. And you can see the delivery time for the South East Queensland pod is definitely improved compared to the Australia pod. So for QUT, we're looking at the average time of loans to arrive just slightly over 4 days, which is fantastic. And our Australia pod is just over 7.5 days, which is kind of right on the upper end of what it should be for the Australia pod. So over to you, Peta.
Thank you. So for Bond, the Australia pod is still closer to 10 days. So I looked at this a couple of weeks ago and it was actually greater than 10 days. So this is since the 30th of June. It's now dropped down below 10. We may be finding a bit of variation here from QUT because of a pattern of distribution of our requests that we'll talk about in a couple of slides' time. So QUT is getting them close to the 7 days, and that could be because of the number of requests that are going to the Australia pod compared to the number of our requests that are going to the Australia pod or going to South East Queensland instead. Okay, so if we look at that other problem we had about items not being collected by patrons, we are ecstatic here at Bond that we're seeing items from the South East Queensland pod, only 5% of them are not being collected. And when I looked at this 2 weeks ago, it was 2.9%. So we're still happy with 5.5, but we were sort of jumping out of our seats a couple of weeks ago looking at that one. Compared to the Australia pod, where it's 17.9%, we're still happy with that. It's an improvement on what we were seeing in the middle of last year, which was about 23%, I think. And then the items supplied from outside of Rapido, which aren't picked up, so this is LAD or email partners, is 19%. So even there, we have seen some improvement based on some other things that we do. So at Bond, our on-hold shelf reminder is sent from Alma at 4 days after the item is available for collection. We only send the one reminder. We tried replacing these with personal messaging, but found it made no appreciable difference and was time-consuming for our staff. Undergraduates are the group most likely not to collect an item. If the items do not arrive quickly, then their priority has moved on to something else. This may also be true of some other requesters to a smaller extent. So we still want to reduce wait times as much as possible. Essentially, we want them to arrive before they forget why they requested it. Another strategy we use at Bond is to include a link to My Library Requests in the Request Sent label in Primo. So this is the label when you click that submit button and it says success, your request has been submitted. So we've changed that to also include a link to their library account so they can, and we tell them you can track and cancel requests from there. So the idea is that this user education might prompt them to cancel requests they really don't want or requested by mistake. And over to Cathy to explain what she's seeing at QUT.
That's right. So our students clearly are not as good as the bond students with your 5.5% of items not being collected. We can see a small trend in our data as well, where the items that have been delivered from the South East Queensland pod, so those items that are delivered quicker, fewer of them are not being collected by patrons. I will sort of disclaim from the outset, we don't actually get a lot of our physical loans from the South East Queensland pod, so our sample size here is probably a bit small, so it can be quite variable. But this was the latest data that we'd seen, and we were quite happy with it. We also see, what was saying before, what Bond was saying with sending out the reminders on the hold shelf reminders, we also do that. We previously used to keep our items on the shelf for 7 days for interlibrary loans, but we increased that not so long ago to 14 days, and we send the automatic Alma email out at 7 days. And we did find that did make a little bit of a difference, probably more for staff and researchers picking up when we allowed them the full 14 days to come and collect the item. Back to you, Peter.
Okay, so let's have a look at the distribution of requests. So looking at the bonds results there, we're seeing that 34% of the loans that we supply through Rapido are going to the South East Queensland pod. Sorry, are supplied by the South East Queensland pod, which essentially is QUT. So they're filling 34% of them. 9% of Rapido loans that we ship are going to the South East Queensland pod, which is QUT. And if you look at the QUT side of that, you'll see it's a bit reversed. So a big thank you to QUT. When there are only 2 institutions in the pod, the lending burden naturally falls to the institution with the larger collection. They're certainly helping us out big time. Possible reasons that may contribute to this are the fact that we have the expanded view in Primo as the default, so it's easy for students to request, including undergraduates. It means that the number of unique borrowers has increased and the number of requests is high for our size, for our population. Bond also has a smaller physical collection, reflecting that we only have 4,500 students across 4 faculties, and our collection is not a great match for QUT's broader discipline areas. So QUT no doubt has more requests that are outside of the collection scope that we have. We'd certainly like to have more South East Queensland institutions in the mix to help share out the work.
And we totally agree. We would love to have more institutions in to help share the load. But for now, we're really happy to participate, just firstly to see how a local pod works, if it does realise the benefits we thought it would, and it does regarding delivery times, as well as the sustainability piece. We want to be able to support more sustainable workflows, so books aren't being shipped all over the country if there's one nearby. So we do acknowledge that we are supplying Bond with a lot. As far as our staff workflows are concerned and the impact, there's really been no noticeable difference. Staff haven't noticed any change in how they do any of their handling of requests or anything. So it wasn't really until we looked at the data that we realised kind of how uneven the distribution was. We, of course, knew it would have a level of unevenness, but for now, we're certainly happy to continue on. And as we've said before, we're really hoping that we can also add some Alma resource sharing libraries into this pod. And I think that is all for me.
Okay, well, that's a good segue into our next section, which is to talk about a hybrid pod and what it actually is. So Ex Libris recently published some information in the Documentation Centre, which actually describes a pod, as a hybrid pod, as one that contains libraries performing resource sharing using Alma with Rapido libraries. So essentially within the pod, the offers are calculated based on the holdings of all of the libraries in the pod, regardless of whether they're Rapido or Alma, and it checks their defined available items. And then communications between the Rapido institutions uses Rapido to Rapido functionality. Communications between a Rapido and an Alma institution uses Alma to Alma functionality, and communications between the Alma institutions is using Alma to Alma functionality. So it really is very hybrid in terms of how it operates.
Now, as far as configuration is concerned, this slide talks about the configuration that is required for Alma resource sharing libraries. The Rapido setup, there's very little configuration to do, but this is for the hybrid pod, this is what the Alma resource sharing libraries need to do. And so there will be some time and thought required to participate in a hybrid pod. Now, we haven't been through this process with an Alma resource sharing institution yet. So this is just an overview of what is required. We have had a session with Ex Libris that went through this with us, and that took about an hour. So we don't actually think the work involved is too significant, but I think as any of us that have configured Alma resource sharing in the past know that there's a real headspace you've got to get into and try and work out how it works. But basically, in summary, the steps are the Alma resource sharing library needs to add their library to the resource sharing directory and turn on data sharing. I know we certainly had to turn on data sharing for resource sharing. Download the pod members from the resource sharing directory to their partners list. They attach a suitable borrowing or lending workflow to the pod partners. If you may already have existing workflows set up that work for you, create fulfillment terms of use that align with the pod terms, and update the locate profiles for our Rapido partners so that way they can automatically check availability and requestability. And then adding partners to a rota template and setting up rota assignment rules. So they're the steps we've been told is required, and we do look forward to getting in and doing that with an Alma resource sharing library and really working out how this all works.
Okay, so assuming it's all going swimmingly for us in a few months when we get to testing with hopefully with University of Southern Cross, we can then start looking at what the opportunities this means for the broader community across Australia and potentially New Zealand as well. So we might imagine that we might be members of 3 different pods, a first priority at a city or regional level where we can have quite short delivery times, and that would be first priority for shortening delivery and also for reducing freight costs or freight distances. A second priority might be a broader regional pod with a 7-day delivery, for example, maybe East Coast Australia. And then a third priority, which would be the Australia pod, which potentially could then open that up for reviewing the delivery times in that pod, where we know some institutions are finding it really hard to meet a 7-day delivery time. But certainly it appears, certainly in Bond's case, prioritising local pods reduces the freight distances, it reduces delivery times, and the shorter delivery times means that more requests are actually being borrowed.
And this is our final slide, and it's sort of to highlight, well, here's what the different pods or regional, city, or sort of the broader pods could look like. The 2 in pink at the moment are the current 2 pods that we have. So we're in the South East Queensland pod for 5 days and of course the Australia pod for 7 days. But you can kind of see that there's a lot of scope for different regions, particularly looking at the existing members within the existing Australian Rapido libraries. There's definitely a case for one sort of in New South Wales around the Sydney region, because there's a lot of institutions there that would be very easy for you to set up as Rapido libraries and start having a really city-based one. We're definitely interested in an East Coast library, an East Coast pod, and we'd also be interested in seeing if there are any New Zealand libraries that would be happy to work with either as a Rapido pod or to join and create an ANZ hybrid pod. So I really think that there's a lot of scope for possibility there. And I know QT and Bond are definitely interested if there are any other Rapido or Alma resource sharing libraries that want to work with us. I think I was just going to say before, sorry, I forgot to say, with regards to setting up different regional pods within Australia, it could be as simple as, so we already have our agreed Australia pod terms. So if you wanted sort of like an East Coast or even more regional, city-based regional ones, it could be the exact same terms and it's only the delivery date times that change. So that would make it really easy for Ex Libris to set up as well. So if people were happy to keep the existing terms and literally change delivery days, then I think that would be a very easy way to progress as well. Thank you, Peter. Next slide.
Okay, we hope we've left you with some food for thought, and there end the puns for today. I'd reiterate what Cathy said. We're certainly open to hearing from any other institutions who are interested in having a discussion or meeting to further these ideas. We can take some questions now, but also if you'd like to send any questions to us via email, our addresses are on the screen there. Thank you. I can see that we've got a couple of questions in the chat. So Andrew asks, would you be relying on Australia Post or looking at more of a courier system? So we just use Australia Post.
Yeah, so does QT. We just use Australia Post for the most part.
Mm-hmm. And the question from Rashmi about who bears the cost of postage. So Bond University Library has in its budget for covering the postage for the request, so it doesn't get passed on to staff or students.
And at QT, yeah, so QT pays for the postage that we send when we ship books to other libraries. Yeah, we pay for the postage. So of course, where we're net lenders, we're paying more for postage than we would otherwise, if we were net borrowers. So, but we're still happy with how it is at the moment.
And there's a question from Patricia. In our case, we have campuses across Australia. So our Sydney campus could be part of New South Wales, but would exclude our other campuses. I assume that would work. So yes, Patricia, when you're defining your available items, you could define it by the location. So you could say, okay, only items in the Sydney location are available for this particular pod. And that looks like it for the questions.
Yep. Oh, yeah, sounds promising. It does sound promising. We would like to see more Australia pods in the mix.
There is one more question. Is there an explanation somewhere of how Rapido chooses which library to send a request to in a pod? It would be useful if it could be automatically calculated according to distance.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, within a pod. Yeah, sorry. Within a pod, I know that they do some sort of distribution of where they go, but to my knowledge, there's no it's not based on distance because they wouldn't have that information. I'm pretty sure we don't provide it. But that's an interesting question. I guess that's probably why they go, we'll set up regional pods and do your priorities.
All right, great. Thank you both. That was great.